When you take apart your average smartphone, what you usually find is something like this: a microphone, or more specifically, a MEMS microphone. MEMS devices have been around for a very long time, but more recently, within the audio enthusiast market, there have been talks of something of a revolution. MEMS drivers are the new in thing within the audiophile market. Many brands are experimenting. Some have even come up with models using MEMS drivers, and some have touted MEMS as the future of audio. So today I would like to talk about this new thing, MEMS. What are they actually? Are they actually good? And of course, to shill. First of all, MEMS clearly is an abbreviation for something, specifically micro electromechanical systems. Now, the definition of MEMS actually refers to systems that have been made using a microfabrication process, which actually doesn't tell you anything about how they produce sound. For example, you could have MEMS drivers that are dynamic in principle, or planar, or even an electrostatic MEMS driver. So MEMS doesn't actually refer to the driver type that it is. But at the end of the day, most MEMS drivers that you see out on the market today are actually of the piezoelectric kind. And some of you probably hear this word and going, what the hell is that? So piezoelectric drivers are actually a completely different class of drivers in of itself. So instead of using voice coils like on dynamic drivers or planar drivers, or electrostatic films like on electrostatics, piezoelectrics use piezoelectric materials to move around, which is completely different from the others that I have mentioned. The simplest explanation I can give is that when you apply electricity to a piezoelectric material, it contracts. It moves. So the typical way in which a piezoelectric driver is manufactured is by taking a piezoelectric layer and then stick it on top of a diaphragm. When you apply electricity to the piezoelectric layer, it contracts, and so does the diaphragm, hence producing sound. I like to joke that piezo drivers are terrible because they are used in doorbells and remind me of a buzzer sometimes. But piezos have been used in the IEM industry for a very long time. It's not new technology, and it's not technology that is also new to our industry. But what is specifically new is the MEMS part of it, the use of microfabrications to create a very tiny, very compact piezoelectric driver. It may or may not result in a better sound, but objectively speaking, yes, it is a smaller driver. Now, you've probably heard about all the great things about MEMS drivers from other people, so let me just flip the script and talk about the problems with MEMS drivers. The first problem, and this is a problem similar to balanced amateur drivers, and that is MEMS will struggle at reproducing the full frequency spectrum, specifically the bass notes. This is a problem that comes with a commonly cited tagline, and that is, there is no replacement for displacement. The problem with smaller and smaller drivers is that at a certain point, it is going to struggle with the lowest bass notes. In a lot of the earlier designs for MEMS prototypes, they tried to kind of fix this issue by almost forcing a perfect seal on people. This helped a little bit, especially with a lot of DSP and EQ, but the main issue is with a less than perfect seal, you still are going to get a lot of bass roll-off. And subjectively, you can also see comments from people who have tested out early prototypes of MEMS IEMs, and the common consensus is almost always the bass is kind of limp. And it is for that reason that is commonly paired up with a dynamic driver, for instance, to make up for this shortfall in the bass regions. But for the earlier MEMS drivers, there's actually one more even greater problem, and that is the fact that you cannot run it without a specialized amplifier. For the early MEMS drivers, you needed something called a DC bias, which is similar to how you would run an electrostatic headphone. You needed either an amplifier, or in this case, basically an energizer, that specifically supports MEMS drivers, which means getting something like the iFi Diablo X, or designing a TWS that is made specifically to run MEMS drivers. Some of you at this point would probably ask, why? Why is it that the old generation of MEMS needed all of these special requirements just to run them? And look, I am man enough to admit when something is above my pay grade. So I shot a DM over to Oratory 1990. You may know him for his measurements and EQ databases. He currently works at LeWitt as an acoustic engineer, but previously he worked as an acoustic engineer at USound. So maybe you can take a look at his initial explanation for why the older MEMS drivers needed special hardware. Do you understand it? Yeah, me neither. We chatted a bit more and I eventually somewhat understood what was going on. The older generation of MEMS drivers behaved very similarly to an electrostatic driver in that yes, it needed a DC bias. What this means is that the voltage that is fed into the MEMS drivers need to always be positive, which is bad because our typical audio signals are in AC, which means that the voltages swing into the negatives. So Nerd Talk Alert, previously in the older generation of MEMS drivers, the piezoelectric layer, which is made out of a material called PZT, is made out of a process called the sol gel process, which is also the reason why they depolarize at negative voltages. Whereas in the current generation of MEMS, the PZT crystal is grown directly on the die itself, which increases its piezoelectricity and therefore doesn't shit itself when the voltages go below zero. For those of you who have understood absolutely nothing, in a nutshell, this means a MEMS driver that can be run off a headphone jack. So we've talked about the cons of MEMS. So what about the good things about them? Well, first of all, the most obvious of which would be that it is tiny. Arguably the most important part about MEMS would be the first M, and that is the word micro. It allows you to build extremely tiny systems, especially when compared to other traditional methods. So here is your typical piezo driver, and you compare it next to your typical MEMS driver, and you realize there is an absolute gulf in terms of the size difference. The second great thing about a MEMS driver would also be one of its cons as well, and that is the fact that it makes a really good tweeter. As I mentioned, MEMS drivers are kind of bandwidth limited. They don't do bass very well, but at the same time, because of the fact that they don't do low frequencies, it makes them very good for very specific applications, specifically tweeting. And of course, one of the great marketing points around MEMS would be the fact that it's fast. And I don't mean it in the snake oil way that we in the hobby use it. No, I meant it in the most literal sense that it is one of the fastest drivers that we have available now. And because it can vibrate in rates of tens of thousands of times, it means that it has a lot of high frequency applications. So where a driver like a BA would fall off starting around 40,000 Hz, which is plenty good by the way, beyond our human hearing, a MEMS driver on the other hand can vibrate in excess of 80,000 times. That means in theory their upper frequency range would be in excess of 80 kilohertz. Now, there are many brands that are making MEMS drivers as we speak, for example, Fraunhofer, Audio Pixels, or even Sony, but we'll be focusing on the three that are most relevant in our industry, and that is XMEMS, USound, and AAC technologies. Now, the first IEMs to be using MEMS technology would be all the way back in 2023. Now, there is debate on who exactly is the first. From my own searching, it seems like the first was the IMR Seraph. Now, this is kind of a contentious entry because the IMR Seraph, as far as I knew, didn't actually require any kind of specialized hardware, like for example, the i5 Diablo X. And again, they were using the first generation of MEMS drivers, which made everything seem really suspicious. Some people theorize that IMR, using the XMEMS drivers, were actually not intending to energize them at all. So based on my own current knowledge of the older XMEMS drivers and the fact that it requires a DC bias, I don't think I can really regard the Seraph as the first of its kind. Rather, if we go into second place, we have the brand Singularity coming up with the model Oni. I personally have not heard the brand Singularity, nor have I heard of the Oni until I actually started researching into this, but they do use XMEMS drivers, and yes, you do require the i5 Diablo X in order to use them. A little later, we have a Vietnamese brand called Soranic, actually a sponsor on the headphone graph tool, who created the MEMS 2. The MEMS 2 curiously actually used two different MEMS drivers from two different brands, one from XMEMS and one from USound. The XMEMS driver played the full range while the USound driver was used specifically as a tweeter, and yes, you also required the iFi Diablo X in order to use them. Thereafter, the first true wireless buds to use MEMS technology was in fact Creative with their Orvana Ace as well as their Orvana Ace 2. Now fast forward to present time, and a lot of these IEMs are kind of swept under the rug, and I would say it outright, irrelevant. In today's market, I would say there's really only 3 models that use MEMS drivers that are relevant today. The first of which would be what is considered the world's most expensive IEM, the Bryce Audio Fugaku. They use the older generation of XMEMS drivers, which means yes, they require specialized hardware, which they do provide. Inside that brick contains active crossovers, which means every single driver is individually powered, which includes the XMEMS driver. The next one on the list would be the binary EP321, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the world's first passive tribrid MEMS IEM. The EP321 uses the latest generation of MEMS tweeters, this time coming from a company called AAC Technologies, and yes, it can be run completely off the jack. Next, we have the Kiwi Years Halcyon, which is also a tribrid IEM that uses, well, yes, the newest generation of MEMS tweeters, but specifically from USound. Instead of using the individual MEMS tweeters like on the EP321, what Kiwi Years have done instead is to use the 6mm MEMS module that is kind of permanently attached to a dynamic driver. So while both of them do use MEMS drivers, I would say that they are both kind of also completely different in, first of all, the drivers that they're using, and second of all, in their implementation. A side note, Kiwi Years have also advertised the Halcyon as being the world's first tribrid MEMS IEM, which is controversial. But on that note, let's talk about number 3. The Moondrop X Crinacle Silicon. The Silicon is our very first tribrid IEM that uses the latest generation of MEMS tweeters, which means again, yes, it can be run off of your headphone jack. This is a first accomplishment for both Moondrop and I. A single dynamic driver woofer, 2 balanced armatures, as well as not 1, but 2 latest generation MEMS tweeters. The Silicon would also be Moondrop's first IEMs to be passively tuned to the population average diffuse field response. Silicon also comes with a fully filled 3D printed resin shell for added durability, as well as the clear transparency that allows you to see all of the great electronics that we have inside. The Silicon retails for $249 and is now available at Shenzhen Audio and Hangout.audio. So there is really not a lot of things that I can say at this point. There's a few crowns that we can claim. For example, the Silicon would be the cheapest tribrid MEMS IEMs available as of right now. The Silicon is also the only MEMS tribrid IEMs that is specifically tuned to the population average diffuse field curve. And lastly, the treble tuning, which I predict would probably be the most controversial of all of its attributes. With a new driver technology, there is always a tendency to overboost its particular frequencies in order to kind of show off, which has been the case right now. You see a lot of MEMS IEMs with very clearly bright signatures, which is a good thing if you are into that, but it also shows a clear gap in the market for a MEMS hybrid IEM that doesn't overdo its treble response and kind of just leaves everything reasonable. So effectively, with Silicon, we want to show people a taste of what a reasonably tuned MEMS tweeter can sound like. So some of you may be wondering, Crin, how is it like actually tuning with a MEMS tweeter? Is it actually good? Is it actually the future? I think this is a very nuanced discussion, and my simple answer to that is that I think that MEMS, or the new MEMS tweeter, is simply a means to an end. It is a tweeter, no doubt, and I don't think that it's inherently superior nor inferior to our current existing lineup of tweeter technologies. They are similar to the microplanar tweeters that I have used in terms of the frequency response characteristics. There is no bleed into the lower frequencies, which means that if you want to tune something that's exclusively in the ultra high end of frequencies, the MEMS tweeters do it very well. And in terms of the claims about it being revolutionary, I would say that it's revolutionary in the context of it being a piezoelectric tweeter. It doesn't sound anything like your typical piezoelectric tweeter, which I have commonly criticized for having many micro peaks and just sounds, again, rather buzzy at times. This MEMS tweeter sounds really good. But at the same time, I don't think that it's a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't think that it's the only tweeter that we ever have to use, for instance. So if you ask me personally, I would say yes, it is great, arguably amazing as a super tweeter, but at a premium-ish price. And I'm saying this as the guy who's trying to show you on my product. MEMS tweeters are great, but at the same time, we can't let the hype kind of envelop us in all things. New technologies all have their use cases, and in my case, I would say yes, it's a means to an end. MEMS tweeters are great at shaping the response very, very delicately, like we have done with the silicon, where we don't overdrive it and it comes off with a very smooth, yet not dark response. So if you're someone who wants to give MEMS a shot, try the silicon, the cheapest MEMS tribrid on the market today. And that is all that I have for you today. Links are all down in the description for those of you who are interested. But for the rest of you, I'll see you guys next week, and don't die. Fuck off.